Hi, Professor Orwig. Today I'll be presenting on the architecture of Frank Gehry. So to begin, I want to give a little bit of context to his personal background. So Frank Gehry was born in 1929 in Toronto, and then in 1947, his family moved to California, and he went on to get a degree in architecture from the University of Southern California. And after he graduated from USC, he actually served 2 years in the US Army from 1955 to 56. And during his time in the Army, he was limited to using very basic building materials like sheet metals. And we actually see this influence a lot throughout his later career. So then moving into just some general characteristics of his architecture. So after returning from the Army, his early work in Los Angeles was in the offices of Pereira and Luckman, and then the office of Gruen. And they both practiced a very minimalistic approach to modernism. So some of his early commissions followed this, but by 1972, we already see him diverging greatly from this approach, and his buildings began to utilize more trapezoidal forms and more sloping roofs. And then by the later 1980s, we see Gehry's use of angular forms being replaced by increasingly curved shapes, which gave his buildings, such as the Weissman Museum in the middle there, a very twisting shape with sort of the appearance of being in motion. So these complex forms definitely evolved throughout his career. And then, like I talked about with his experience in the Army, he often utilized very everyday materials that were uncommon for architects to use, such as chain link fences, which we see in his own home in Santa Monica in that picture there on the left. And then lastly, he was significant because he can't really be placed in one category of design. He definitely drew inspiration from multiple architectural styles, such as late expressionist in the way he distorted building forms, as we see in the Guggenheim Bilbao. And he also used elements of deconstructivist design, but his buildings never really wholeheartedly fit under one architectural category, and that was definitely a big part of his significance. So then moving into important buildings, first I want to talk about his own home in Santa Monica, which was constructed in 1978, because it's a very early significant example of how his architecture diverged from the minimalistic modern forms that he worked with when he was under both of those firms. And he really took on these increasingly angular forms and also this use of ordinary building materials that we see. So he basically took a traditional Dutch colonial house with a gambrel roof, and he enlarged it and then sort of surrounded it with these new walls created from these ordinary materials like chain link fences and sheet metal, corrugated metal. And then this created really interesting intersections, which the Roth and Clark textbook writes created, quote, a dynamic sculptural object. And we see this word this phrase of sculptural objects repeat a lot throughout Gehry's later architecture as well. So I think this building was significant because it showed how Gehry, although he used these very ordinary everyday materials, he also was in some senses using very sophisticated ideas, because he was relying on his fine arts training to incorporate these art forms through his complex buildings. And throughout his career, we see how his art training sort of drives this approach that he wants to emulate pure art forms through his buildings. So then moving into the next significant building, this American Center was built in Paris, France in 1988 to 1984. And it was definitely one of his very first significant international buildings. And we also see how his earlier use, such as in his own house, of very sharp angular forms juxtaposed over rectilinear buildings, was largely replaced by more curved forms and twisting and spiraling shapes. So the design center section was a series of curved and intersecting volumes that were covered on the facade or on the outside in limestone. And the American Center was interesting because it wasn't wanting to copy French buildings, but rather offer sort of like an American interpretation of French ideas. And interestingly, I thought one point that I found that was interesting was a lot of people thought that he could have done more here, because this building, compared to his later works especially, is much less bold. And it is pretty sculptural, but it also, the way it uses limestone and the way it sort of fits into its surroundings. If we could see the other buildings around it and the park limits, it actually does suit its surroundings pretty well. So it was, some people thought it was too Parisian and kind of could have been bolder, but it definitely does show the emergence of this increasingly sculptural form that he uses. And then another really significant part of it is that it was his first building project to utilize a French design software called CATIA, and he could electronically model very complex designs on this software, which moving forward really increased his freedom in using these curved shapes and complex sculptural forms. So then the next building, which I've actually visited since I live in Minneapolis, is the Frederick R. Weissman Museum in Minneapolis. And it was built from 1990 to 1993. And then Gehry was also behind its 2011 expansion. So when viewed from the south and east sides, the building is constructed of brick, which we see in the image on the left. And the brick fits in with the other historic buildings of the University of Minnesota on the Northrop Mall, where it's located. But when viewed from the north and west sides, Gehry used a series of these curved and intersecting brushed stainless steel sheets, and they actually depict a fish and a waterfall in a very abstract manner, but fish were actually a symbol that he carried a lot through his architecture, interestingly, but it also kind of nods to the natural environment of Minnesota. So he combined this very angular, tightly organized brick structure with this huge sense of movement created by the stainless steel. And then on the interior, he really maximized the impact of the art by creating large, open, airy spaces with pretty simple white walls and natural wood flooring. And I think this building definitely shows how he continued the use of sculptural form and rejection of straight lines that he sort of began in the American Center, and we see get even more and more bold throughout his career. So then the next significant building, which is one of his most well-known, is the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, built 1999 to 2003. It was one of multiple concert halls that he built, and it has definitely been one of his most unanimously praised works. In the Los Angeles Times, they wrote that, quote, Disney Hall, in that sense, may rank as the most effective answer to doubters, naysayers, and grumbling critics a major American architect has ever produced. And this was largely because Gehry was often criticized for his architecture being impractical or having a poor use of materials, but he was able to achieve very near perfect acoustics in this building. So it kind of showed he could not only create these interesting sculptural forms, but they were also very functional. So the Walt Disney Concert Hall is in LA's Music Center, and it's one of 4 concert halls there. And Gehry was described as wanting to democratize classical music through this design, which really mirrors sort of the informal nature of Los Angeles city culture that he wanted to emulate. And it stood out from the other music halls because of its complex sculptural form and the way that it appears to expand outwards. So Gehry had originally pushed for a stone facade on the building, but then the finishing touches on this building occurred after the Guggenheim Bilbao was finished, and due to the huge success of his use of metal there, he was pushed to use metal. So he used stainless steel on this building. And within, when a visitor enters, the lobby entrance is very narrow, and people even describe it as snake-like. But then once you reach the auditorium, it's this huge open release, and that's sort of the most awe-inspiring moment for a visitor, which is what Gehry really wanted to achieve. So this was definitely a significant work in the way that he both showed the functionality of his work and how it was so unanimously praised for how it added to the Los Angeles city. So then next is definitely his most well-known work is the Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain, which was built 1993 to 97. So Gehry was jointly commissioned to build it by the Basque government, who wanted to revitalize and attract tourists to this city, since it was it had declining blue-collar industries, and they wanted to create a new cultural attraction that would draw in tourists and revitalize the city. And then at the same time, the Guggenheim Museum in New York was holding a competition for a regional location that they could expand to, and the two interests sort of coincided. And then Gehry was chosen to do the work. So he chose a location, as we can see in the image on the left, he chose a location on the riverfront, which sort of connected the city center to the more dilapidated old factories and industries that were on the riverfront. So he again used the CATIA design software, which enabled him to create these huge sweeping forms that it feels like the building doesn't really have many spaces where it isn't curving. So this really allowed him the freedom to do that. And one of the most significant aspects of the building is its material, because it's actually made of titanium, because the Soviet Union collapsed at the time of this building's construction, and desperate for profits, they basically put a huge amount of titanium, which is usually really rare and expensive, on the market. And so Gehry was able to actually use titanium to cover the building, and this rolled titanium covers all of the outside surfaces. And not only does it really create this shiny building that's interesting to look at, but it can be rolled super thin. It's only 1/3 of a millimeter thick. And so the outside actually moves slightly in the wind, and this makes the building appear to shimmer, and it sort of changes the way that it interacts with light. So in some ways, the influence of Wright's Guggenheim in New York shows through here, since his was sort of seen as the mothership, and in some ways, the Guggenheim Bilbao emulates a ship form, but it was definitely Gehry creating an entirely unique building. And within the atrium is a really significant aspect of it. It lets, it's seen in the image on the right, it lets visitors see up to the museum's 5th and final floor, and above them, catwalks and walkways to the galleries in the upper floors go over their heads. And then also the use of titanium is continued from outside to inside, especially in the atrium, where these titanium and plaster and limestone structures that kind of resemble tree trunks rise up, and the stairs and elevators and a lot of the utilities are hidden within these tree trunk-like structures. So the Guggenheim Bilbao was definitely hugely influential in revitalizing the city's economy, and it actually created what was called the Bilbao effect, and it inspired other cities to try to commission these large, eye-catching buildings, often museums, in order to increase the city's cultural capital and boost the economy. So lastly, I just want to reiterate why I think Gehry is such a significant architect, as we've seen through the previous 5 works, and then I included a few photos of some of his other famous works that sort of reinforce these themes. So I think it's really interesting because these 5 buildings definitely highlight how Gehry was able to blend aspects of many styles, but he also created elements in his buildings that couldn't really be placed under one specific architectural style. They were entirely unique. And he's definitely an extremely multifaceted architect. And one way that I really thought was interesting that he showed this was how he could both use everyday materials like corrugated sheet metal, chain link fences, and yet they were seemingly crude. And yet he could also combine these materials with a sophisticated knowledge of classical art, which he was trained in, and sculptural forms. And he really wanted to create these convey these pure art forms through his architecture. So I just thought that was interesting how he could accomplish both such crude materials and such sophisticated designs. And so his architecture is often characterized as late expressionist, but like I said earlier, we see some aspects of modernism, some deconstructivism aspects. We really see a lot of different styles blended in his work, yet they sort of became entirely his own, and in a way he defined an entirely new architectural style of Frank Gehry that still persists today. So thank you for listening to my presentation.